So we're going to talk about this morning that joy doesn't give up. But before we get into that, bring the morning humor. I happened to find a story about a man who was at work. He was very busy doing last-minute details on getting reports ready and a presentation for a really important meeting that was coming up for like all the executives at his company. He had to get this all done, so he's hurrying up, but the phone suddenly rang, and it was his wife. He thought, well, I need to take, I always try to take she doesn't call me unless it's important, so I take her call. So he answers the phone, and she says, well, honey, I have good news and bad news. And he says, well, dear, tell you what, why don't you give me the good news? We're going to have to worry about the bad news later. So she says, okay, that's fine. I just wanted to let you know then the good news is that the airbags in your brand new car work really, really well. Oh, no. Yeah, that's another example of when life takes a turn in the story that you weren't expecting. When life goes a direction you weren't planning on. I want to begin this morning by kind of rewriting some popular Christmas stories. You probably know them. And after each rewrite that I give to you, we're going to have a moment of audience participation. And I want you to let me know if you think that made the story better by the rewrite that I offer. Okay, does it make the story better in this new retelling? So, for example, very popular Christmas story about Rudolph. Well, in my story, what if there was a reindeer named Rudolph who has a regular nose, and he helps Santa deliver his presents all over the world with no hiccups in the plan? The end. Now, who would say that makes a better story? Not really? Okay, how about, this one really isn't a Christmas story. This is, what about the story of Spider-Man? What if this was a story that started off, once upon a time, a guy named Peter Parker lived in a world that had no villains, no crime, no hardship, no spider bites, but instead he was a guy that went to college. The end. Does that make it better? All right. Last one. How about this one? Lord of the Rings. Wildly popular all over the world. What if we change it to once upon a time there were some happy hobbits? The end. How lovely. If you're reading a book like that or going to a movie that was like that, and you sat there and it just went along that way, I don't think many of us would feel like that was a really great story that was told. But instead, good stories involve conflict, brokenness, and trials. The good stories, the best stories, talk about the problems, but then how the characters of the story persevere and prevail through those trials. And we know that at some level, every good story has conflict, brokenness, and or trial in it. And we know it to be true, inevitably, in the stories that we listen to or read or watch. And without it, we'd actually be kind of bored. Without it, there'd be almost no point to a story. We need the intrigue. We need the adventure. We need the prevail for the story to capture our attention and to probably make us feel like we've engaged in something that was good. The definition of a good story in our own lives, however, is very different. When we think of our lives and what makes a good story, we think of it only by the story that has none of that in it. In our own lives, we define good and bad, better or worse, but we think of our stories are only good when there's no bad. When things go right, when we know that everything's going the way as it ought. And in fact, when we're in the middle of brokenness, when we're in the middle of trials, when we're in the middle of conflict, it probably feels like nothing is good at all. It feels like it's wrong. It feels like things should be different. It feels like things should be better. And we often find ourselves wondering, what has happened? How could this be? Maybe even wondering, this can't be a part of God's plan. It can't possibly be the story that God is writing for my life. What needs to happen is for him to fix this. Where did I get off track? What did I do wrong? This isn't fair. These are the kinds of thoughts and questions that go through our mind when our story goes in an unexpected direction or takes a bad turn. It's almost like we have a basic assumption that life is supposed to be easy, blessed, and fair. And anything else, we must be in the middle of the wrong story, somebody else's story. Well, what can we learn about a good story from God's story? As he writes the story of his life, what does the story say? Well, let's go to Luke chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, and we'll talk about the beginning of the story as Jesus enters our world. We'll look at the Nativity account. And as we read it, I'd like you to consider the plot line of the characters. Consider the backdrop of the Nativity account. Consider the history of what's going on or the context in which the story emerges. Look to see if God chooses for himself a life of ease and comfort, blessings, riches, and adoration. Or is God's story something different? Do we see potential problems? Do we find that there are broken systems? Do we see unfair treatment or practices? Ask yourself these kinds of questions as we look at the story, hopefully with fresh eyes, and maybe take out some of the familiarity that we have approached the story with year after year after year. So Luke chapter 2, verse 1, it says, about this time, Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor, decreed that a census would be taken throughout the nation. This census was taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Everyone was required to return to his ancestral home for this registration. Because Joseph was a member of the royal line, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, King David's ancient home, journeying there from the Galilean village of Nazareth. He took with him Mary, his fiancée, who was obviously pregnant by this time. And while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. And she gave birth to their first child, a son. She wrapped him in a blanket and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the village inn. Wow, isn't that pretty? Isn't it a lovely story? Isn't it just a great story? I mean, we've turned it into that. We've become so familiar with it. We think of it as such a precious, beautiful, victorious thing. And yet, in reality, it's a story that's in the middle of broken systems, inconvenience, messiness of life. We have our manger scenes. There's traditions that tell us kind of a sterilized version of the story. But when we step back and think about it, the same question for God arises with his story that we often ask of our own. Why this way? Why did you do it like this, God? Why is it going this way? If you could do anything, if you could create any story you wanted for your son, why this story? Well, I want to offer three things for us to consider this morning. Three things that might help us get through the hard times and instead hang on to joy in the midst of our chaos, in the midst of our struggles and problems, would help us to not only prevail, but prevail with joy and faith and strength. And the first is this. I want to say to you this morning that your affliction is not your assignment. When we go through struggles in life, our tendency is to withdraw. It's to shut down. It's to fall back. It's to retreat. It's to feel like we have no usefulness left and we can't do anything good until life kind of gets back on track. It's easy to focus on our problems and give up on the assignments that God has given to us to serve him in the world around us. But what can we learn from God's story? It seems that Jesus begins his mission on earth with every disadvantage imaginable. Think through the story we just read, and what are some of those disadvantages or unfair situations? Well, to start, Jesus was born to a Jewish family, and the Jews are currently under Roman authority. They're not powerful. They're not in a place of authority. They're not even an important family by worldly standards. Then this census, what was its purpose? Well, it was about power. It was about control. It was about finding out how many Jews were out there and about figuring out where they lived and who they were so they knew how to keep them under control. And so once they knew who they were, they could extract their taxes to continue building their empire. Then you have Joseph and Mary, young couple, forced away out of family and homes. Verse 5 said that she was obviously pregnant. So she's not like at maybe the easier stages early on. She's at the very end. She's showing, she's uncomfortable. It's obvious to everybody that she's pregnant. And it also seems to make sure that we understand that she is just Joseph's fiance at this point. And they're not married. A huge stigma at that time in their situation. They're poor. They're captives. Most likely they've probably been even banished from their own people. Then, of course, they arrive in Bethlehem. And here it's time to give birth. And there's nowhere to stay. There's no private place for them to go. There's nowhere that she can give birth to this child. And so they end up finding shelter in the animal stables, as we know. And again, something that we've romanticized a bit in our day and age. But when you think back to her situation, giving birth next to the animals, and just her and Joseph, no one else around. Think of God's story that he chooses for himself. Instead of power, he arrives in poverty. Instead of privilege, he's given to two paupers. And instead of position, he starts in this lowly place. If you could have the power to write any story you chose, it probably would not be this story. These problems, conflicts, demeaning circumstances, however, did not change the mission as to why God came. In fact, they enhance that purpose in many ways. No matter what you're going through, your afflictions are not your assignment. When we are struggling or hurting or life feels like it's falling apart, it tends to overshadow everything else. Yet we can let it become our greatest joy. Instead of it consuming our thoughts, manipulating our decisions, sending us into isolation, robbing us of our joy, what if our problems and our greatest struggles become the very thing that God wants to use to demonstrate his power and presence in our lives? Doesn't feel like that when health problems arise. Doesn't feel like that when financial setbacks come our way. Doesn't feel like that when we've failed or we're broken or we lose a relationship that was important. Sometimes whatever hurt and brokenness we're going through becomes the very thing that God wants to use, but oftentimes at the beginning of the story, it feels like quite the opposite. You know, I want to let you know about something in our church. We talked about this at our annual meeting a couple of weeks back. We want to make sure you're aware publicly and broadly that as we have been saying, Hilliard Life has closed down their ministries here. What that means to us, a lot of things relationally, although we still see them. They were just here in the office this last week. And we're still planning on events. Several of them are going to join us for our Christmas caroling on Wednesday. So we're excited about that. But one big piece is that we've suddenly lost $10,000 out of our budget for next year. And it's a budget that we didn't hit this year. And so you can imagine, as we're looking at that, and actually the beginning of last year, we lost almost another $10,000 out of our budget. So in the last 2 years, we've lost about more than 20% of our budget. of no doing of our own, and not what we planned and not what we thought. And suddenly we find ourselves in this crisis of how do we keep the lights on, and how do we pay the heating bill, and how do we take care of things that we want to do. And you know what happens is immediately we start pulling back. Immediately we start saying, oh, we can't do this anymore. Oh, we can't, well, I don't know, the mission in Africa, it might have to stand on its own now. Oh, well, we can't afford to go out and do this thing in the community. We don't have the money to do that, this and that. And immediately the sense is we've got to be responsible, so we've got to pull back. And I just want to say that if we're not going to be a church that serves the work of the kingdom, we have no purpose in being here to begin with. And we cannot let this current affliction determine the assignments that we're going to serve in the world, in our community, or wherever we believe God is leading us to go. Now's a time to trust in God. Now's a time to see what He's going to do. Now's a time to just believe that we're going to do everything we can to serve where we think He's calling us until He says we're done. If He says we're done, then praise be to God, we'll find the next thing that He has us to do. But we need to understand that our assignment is not our affliction. And whatever pain and struggle we're going through cannot determine whether or not we're fit to serve God in this world. Second of all, can I say to you that your affliction is not your destination. Whenever you're going through troubles and trials, it's not the end of the story. Whatever you're going through right now, just keep on going. Don't give up. Joy hangs in there and moves forward. Where you are today is not where you have been, nor is it where you are going and God is taking you. God is not through with you yet, so keep trusting in Him and keep pressing on towards your reward. Jesus started in the manger. Then He went to a cross, but now He sits on a throne. Where He started in God's story has nothing to do with where He ended up. Jesus started as a pauper, but He ended up a king. He may have started in the manger, but now He sits at the right hand of the Father. He may have been wrapped up in swaddling clothes, but now He's wearing His white robe of righteousness. And whatever God has you currently in, whatever struggle you find yourself in today, has nothing to do with where He's taking you tomorrow. And God can do the same thing in your life. It may not be today. It may not be next year. You may have to wait a while before you see God reveal whatever plan He has for your life. But if you learn to trust in Him, He is faithful, and the pain and the hurt and the failures of today are not the last chapter in the book of your life. God has brought you this far, and He will not leave you or forsake you. He'll take you the rest of the way. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, it says, looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. It was for joy that He took the steps towards the cross that were before Him. It was the joy that endured the cross. It didn't matter where He was. What mattered, where He was going, and what God was going to do through what He was accomplishing. Jesus knew that the cross was not the destination. He didn't want to go to the cross. Oh, we were talking about this last week. Grayson mentioned it this morning during our prayer time, that Jesus actually prayed, God, if there's any other plan, okay, if you maybe in the 11th hour here, you can come up with a different way, I'm all ears. I'd love to hear it. I'm ready for plan B, because I don't like plan A very much right now. As He thought about the cross, and He knew the suffering and the pain and the struggle of that part of the story. And yet, He trusted in the Lord and knew that even the cross was not the final destination. And so He endured and went forward. Singer-songwriter Lauren Wells, not Lauren Wells, Lauren, no, the guy. Torrin, that's why I'm off. Torrin Wells, not Lauren. Torrin Wells. He's got a pretty popular song out right now that says, God's not done with you. It goes like this, the chorus anyways, it says, God's not done with you. Even with your broken heart and your wounds and your scars. God's not done with you. Even when you're lost and it's hard and you're falling apart. God's not done with you. It's not over, it's only begun. So don't hide, don't run, because God's not done with you. If you're not dead, you're not done. And God has a plan for your story that hasn't been written yet. And he's writing out that story, and he's working in your life, and he's still doing things through you, and he's still taking you places, and he still has plans for your life when you trust in him. God still wants to do great things in and through your life. Joy doesn't give up, and you're probably your final destination. Third and last, can I say your affliction is not your identity? It seems to me that when we start experiencing hard times, when we are going through struggles, when we begin to define ourselves based upon, or we begin to start defining ourselves and seeing ourselves based upon those very struggles that we're having. We don't see our potential. Instead, we see our problems. We limit our potential. We evaluate our worth not based on the new life of Jesus Christ that's within us, instead based upon the mistakes that we've made, based upon the limits that we have, based upon the problems that we find ourselves in. Think again of our story from Jesus' birth. Jesus came as a baby, born human form. You see, God came humbly. It was a time of violent oppression. He was born to an unwed teenage girl. He was born in a home for animals. It wasn't pretty, but that wasn't the end. Through this brokenness, our God told a story where he loved us so much that he would not remain distant and separate and apart from us, but instead he would come down and live amongst this humble state, and he would still become the Savior of the world. Didn't matter where he was born and how he started, he still knew who he was. It didn't matter what problems and conflicts were the beginning of his story. What mattered was that he was going to become the Savior of the world, and he lived out his days as such. Do you see limits where God might be providing opportunity? Are you tempted to give up because affliction has come your way? Let's consider these rewrites one more time that I had at the beginning of the message. What if we had a story about Rudolph who had a funny nose and everybody made fun of him, and so he was embarrassed and he runs off into hiding. Santa can't find his way and Christmas is ruined. What if there's a guy named Peter who gets bitten by a spider, turns radioactive, and spends the rest of his life in his basement? What if Frodo puts on the ring, evil wins, and the world is destroyed? It came close, but goodness prevailed. Because they stepped into their situation, their problems, their adversities, their conflicts, their struggles. They stepped into them. So don't let your failures define who you are. Don't let your problems dictate what you can do. Don't give up and let your affliction become your identity. Have you ever felt like if something bad is going to happen, it will probably happen to me? I'm poor. I'm divorced. I'm just average. I'm ugly. I'm stupid. I'm untalented. I'm shy. I'm a failure. You see, we take our problems and we let them define who we are. I read a story this week about a lady who wanted to start a family. And she started praying that God would give her a baby. And she prayed and prayed and prayed, and the baby didn't come. She asked her pastor in her church to start praying with her to give her a child. And she waited, and 1 year became 3 and became 5. And she was just so hurting and broken. She couldn't understand why. All of her other friends were having children. She couldn't have a baby. She thought she was a perfect candidate for a child and had life in the right order. And she wondered, but why? Why is this so difficult? Why is this broken? What are the problems? Then she started to feel like she was getting farther away from God because she was beginning to assume that God decided she wasn't fit as a mother to have a baby. She began to decide that maybe it was her fault. She wasn't doing something right. She wondered why everything was wrong. And then she started getting angry. And angry with God. Why are you doing this to me? Why aren't you giving me this thing? That would be a good thing, and I would love this child, and I would teach this child about you. And she just was just all wrapped up, and it was consuming her thoughts, and it was consuming everything. She thought she could be a good mother. She was assuming God decided she couldn't, and she saw herself as the barren one. And it consumed her thoughts, her energy, and her joy. Everything in life felt like it was all wrong, and she couldn't figure out why it was happening to her. Finally, she gave up on having her own child, and she began entertaining the idea of adopting. She looked into that, and the day finally came, she was awarded and given a baby. She said that within the first 5 seconds of holding this baby boy, 5 years of questions and struggling and wondering was over. That moment, she knew that she wasn't waiting for God to give her the son that she wanted, but she was waiting for the time when God was up to his plan and gave her that son. This son. That's what God had decided for her. Joy is not about happiness or cheer. It's not about Christmas magic that we're looking for this season, trying to buy presents or do things. Joy is about committing in life to know that God is with you. That he works even in your brokenness, and he has a plan for your life. And he wants to take your story, as broken as it might be, and turn it into something beautiful. Are you trusting the Lord with your life? Think of 2 questions as we end up. Joy doesn't give up. So I want to ask you these 2 questions. Number 1, has God ever helped you before? We forget that when we're going through it. When things don't go the way we thought. When our plans didn't work out. We forget that he's been faithful before. So remember this morning, he's helped you before. He's brought you to this point. There's no way he's going to give up on you now. And number 2, so what are you going through now? Own it, name it, start praying through it. Figure out where you're struggling today. Don't let it be your identity. Don't let your affliction be your destination and the end of your story. And don't let your affliction be your assignment, that's all you have in life. But instead, trust in the Lord. Pray and ask him to help you through whatever you're going through and help you to become and do everything he has for you to do.